Hello and welcome. I'm Ali Mustafa and this is Strait Talk. Besieged into submission, why the global outcry over the suffocation of Eastern Ghouta in Syria could play into Bashar al-Assad's hands. Plus, Lebanon left leaderless. Will Saad Hariri's resignation spell another proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And how will Turkey respond? 7 years into Syria's war, the people of Eastern Ghouta near Damascus have endured the worst of the Assad regime's brutality. In 2013, the area was the site of a chemical attack and the so-called red line that then US President Barack Obama had drawn but never enforced. Despite civilian suffering, the suffocation of Eastern Ghouta continues unabated. And just this past week, the Syrian regime launched at least 10 airstrikes. A critical food shortage due to the regime's siege is pushing the city's residents to their limits. There's been international outcry since, but is that how the Syrian regime wants it? Courtney Keeley reports with exclusive footage from inside besieged Eastern Ghouta.
She's 1 year and 1 month old and is suffering from malnutrition.
Yassine says her younger daughter Amar weighed 1.3 kilograms at birth and is getting frailer.
I didn't get enough nutrition myself while I was pregnant with her. Everything was expensive and we were under siege.
3 children died of acute malnutrition and lack of medical care recently in Eastern Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus under siege by Bashar al-Assad's forces.
So many children are suffering from the malnutrition and dying in front of our eyes, and we are unable to do anything for them.
Once again, Syrian children are at the mercy of a man known for none. Eastern Ghouta, just east of central Damascus, was one of the birthplaces of the uprising against Assad more than 6 years ago. It's one of the last remaining rebel strongholds in Syria. Regime forces launched the largest chemical weapons attack here in 2013. 1,400 people were killed, including at least 426 children. In the last year, Assad's forces have sealed off the vast network of underground smuggling tunnels locals relied on. They recently shut down the last entry point into the neighborhood. Once known as the Basket of Damascus for its lush orchards and produce, the area is now in desperate need of food, fuel, and medicine.
We are a few kilometers away from the capital Damascus, where they are living like it's paradise, while we live like it's hell.
The UN called the siege an outrage and for it to be lifted immediately. It's been widely seen as a starve and surrender tactic used by Assad and other cities like Homs and eastern Aleppo. Speaking from inside Eastern Ghouta, Akram Tameh, the representative of the opposition's UN-recognized provisional government, told us the situation was dire.
The regime has decimated the healthcare system in the area through purposely targeting hospitals. More than 40 hospitals and clinics have gone out of service due to direct shelling. The regime has also enforced a medical siege on the area and is preventing all kinds of medical aid from coming in.
A few humanitarian convoys have gotten in recently with medicine and food, but with only enough aid for a few tens of thousands in 1 month.
Everyone is lying. We have seen nothing. 49 trucks entered. Half of them were empty. They ignored the people and the starving children gathering around them.
Turkey, Russia, and Iran established Eastern Ghouta as one of 4 de-escalation zones in Syria at recent peace talks in Astana. Yet government bombings targeting local opposition groups continue. At least 7 children were killed there in a recent regime-led airstrike that hit a nursery school.
We keep getting promise after promise, and all we get is shelling. Our revolution is an orphan. Everyone has abandoned us.
Courtney Keeley, Strait Talk.
And to discuss the situation in Eastern Ghouta further, I'm joined by Mohammed Khatoub. He's an advocacy director at the Syria American Medical Society. Thank you for joining us. Now, the UN has just come out with a statement that says that the 400,000 people scattered around a dozen towns in Eastern Ghouta near Damascus are facing complete catastrophe. The question, Mohammed, is the Assad regime using these images of starving children as a pressure tactic to reclaim besieged areas?
Thank you, Ali, for hosting me in this discussion about Eastern Ghouta. Well, if you look at the whole image of Syria, how besiegement was used for 6 years now as a tactic of war, it's a war weapon against those people to pressure them to surrender or to leave. So if you look like in October 2016, the number of besieged people in Syria was over 1 million. Now we have 500,000 people besieged, not only in Eastern Ghouta, in different areas. What happened to the other 500,000? They left, they surrender or left. This is what's happening. Siege was not broken ever in Syria to bring aid to people, to bring those basic needs for them, like pure water, like food, like medication. This is what Assad used, and unfortunately the UN is playing a very negative role in this. They didn't enforce bringing aid to besieged people. The number of aid convoys into besieged areas is very little comparing with the needs. Like in Eastern Ghouta, number of entries was only 5 convoys bringing nothing, very few amounts and quantities of food and some medical aid to those people. Comparing with the need, it doesn't cover over than 10% of the need of those people.
What's happening in Eastern Ghouta and the contentions that are taking place, just for our viewers, there are at least 4 groups that are operating in Eastern Ghouta, 2 local groups with Jaish al-Islam and Faylaq al-Rahman, but there's also HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Is this infighting between these different rebel groups inside Eastern Ghouta also partly to blame for what is happening there?
Of course, because this fight, not with the besiegement, but because it also affects the life of people, because it's limitizing access between areas from here to there, and it's also this fight between those local armed groups caused a lot of death, like at least 1,000 people in East Ghouta. It's nothing comparing with the dozens of thousands who died because of the Assad attacks, but also it's something to blame. Besiegement, of course, who's surrounding East Ghouta is Assad militias and Assad forces. Who is depriving people from getting aid is Assad. Of course, this is what's happening. But we don't forget that local armed group could play more positive role in bringing aid.
It's quite a confusing situation, because on the one side you've got the regime besieging these areas, and then when images like this come out, I remember from Madaya you had images of starving children come out as well, and whenever this pressure mounts or there's an outcry against these siege and submit tactics by the Assad regime, why is it the opposition or the people that are being besieged that have to leave the area or submit?
Yeah, here as its tactic against the opposition, who is used here? The civilians. So when you are controlling an area of 400,000 people and people are starving, and then after now 5 or 6 years, pressure on them attacks their civilian facilities, like the most attacked are health facilities, schools, aid warehouses. This is much more than attacking the armed group. Then the locals will start pressuring the armed groups to leave, and they want to leave also.
Does this mean then, if Eastern Ghouta falls as well, that the Assad regime has been successful after 6 years of war?
Has been successful in making war crimes, forcing people to surrender. Have been successful in making the international community, the states, the regional states, the Arabian, the American just watching.
But they say they're fighting terrorism.
Terrorism is in the capital Damascus, is leading all of this. Terrorism, yes, of course, I agree on fighting ISIS, Nusra, Qaeda, but at the end, who caused all of this? Who's using aid now? Who's using the food that people worth? Who is using medication in Syria to force people to surrender or to leave? It's Assad regime now. At the end, it's not about, like, people look at what's happening in besieged areas, like, and see images of kids dying and people starving and people live in unaccepted conditions, but it's much more beyond that. I lived in a besieged area and I fled in 2014 and I walked 35 kilometers through snipers, mines, cameras monitoring the world. I risked my life just to flee with my family. Why? Because it's more beyond than just some food. Well, imagine a mother who lived in Eastern Ghouta where her children is just 10 kilometers away. She wanted to see them. She wanted to. I know a friend who's still there, and he always say that I don't miss food, I don't miss electricity, I don't miss pure water, I don't miss anything. I miss my mother who just 10 kilometers away. I want to see her. The issue here in some other areas, like UN always say, we need a mechanism, we need to make like an agreement between armed group and the regime and things like this. This exists, but it's not enough. They are just making some cosmetic solutions to say that we are working here, we are helping people. No, they are not, and they are responsible also because this aid is guaranteed by the UN. It have to reach those people, in spite of all what the regime is doing. UN said, not me, that 74% of the request to the Syrian government to enter besieged areas was blocked by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Why should the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in any part of this world deny aid access to 400,000 people live there? Imagine that we are here and on the other side of the Bosphorus there is life, food, aid, electricity, water, and you live here in the dark. You will do anything to reach it, but people are deprived from everything. Snipers are here, mines are here, and you cannot chase them. You can see them from your place. You can see when you live in the dark. I remember this when I was there. We went to the roof of the buildings to look at electricity in Damascus, to look at cars coming in and out. And we were deprived from everything. Doctors were counting every single medication because it's very limited.
Mohammed Khatoub, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you.
A declaration of war. That's how Saudi Arabia has described its relationship with Lebanon. The harsh words came after Saad Hariri stepped down as Lebanon's prime minister. His reasons for quitting? Alleged Iranian meddling through Hezbollah. But Hariri's televised resignation wasn't from Beirut, it was from the Saudi capital, Riyadh, leading to questions of whether Hariri was forced to step aside by the Saudi royal family to make way for a new confrontation with Iran. It's all led to fears of destabilization in Lebanon due to what some have called the Middle East's Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now Turkey hasn't taken a side, only saying it will stand by Lebanon to support its political unity and stability. And there may be good reason for that. Its ties with Iran are warming, but Ankara also has a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. Could a new flashpoint in Lebanon change Turkey's position? And to answer this and other questions, I'm joined in the studio by Mujtaba Berghandan. He's an Iranian political and security analyst, and by Jamal Abdullah. He's a senior researcher at TRT World's Research Center. Let's begin with you, Mujtaba. Yes. Is a new proxy war, or is Lebanon a new battleground for a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
The recent developments that shake the region and also it seems that it has started with Hariri's resignation, but I think it has a long stories, at least for 1-2 months after Trump's come to power. Going to the proxy war in the Lebanon as a new battlefield, I think proxy war in Syria and in Lebanon in particular is not a new issue. So we are waiting for the escalation of the crisis. But if you want to know about if it would be the start of a Cold War, my answer is no, because the Cold War actually between Iran and Saudi Arabia has been started in 2006 with the Sheikh Nimar and Nimal's execution, and then came other issues.
Mustafa is saying we have to wait and see. This is an ongoing process. It's nothing new. But how significant is it that Saad Hariri announces his resignation in Riyadh, Jamal?
Well, actually, I would like to say that indeed it is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Lebanon as well. But first of all, to understand what's happening in the region at all, not just in Lebanon, even in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, we have to understand what's happening now in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, since January 2015, a new king came to the power, King Salman. And with coming of King Salman to the power, a new generation, third generation in Saudi Arabia came to the power as well. I mean here, the two Muhammads, Muhammad bin Naif and Muhammad bin Salman. Now, we can notice that the foreign policy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the moment, or at the moment, it's kind of confrontation actually. Started by Yemen, just 3 months after King Salman came to the power, they launched the war in Yemen, as well as they supported actually some opposition in Syria, in Iraq against Iran. And now, what happened last weekend when Saad Hariri decided to announce that he will leave his position as Prime Minister in Lebanon from Riyadh rather than Beirut, that means Saudi Arabia is an actor, very active actor in the region. So what I'm afraid that the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia in many countries in the region becomes actually a real war and direct war.
Jamal, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif just tweeted this recently, a few days ago, and he says the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is engaged in wars of aggression, regional bullying, destabilizing behavior, and risky provocations. It blames Iran for the consequences. Going on what Mustafa was saying, is Saudi Arabia to blame for all of this?
Well, first of all, allow me just to come back to your first question regarding Mr. Saad Hariri. Maybe I should mention here that Mr. Hariri is Saudi citizen, and we know that last weekend, 3-4 days ago, the leaders of Saudi Arabia arrested a lot of princes, ministers, former ministers, and even businessmen. And as we know, Mr. Saad Hariri and his father, Rafiq al-Hariri, who passed away actually in 2004, they are businessmen and they have a big company of construction in Riyadh called OJ. And maybe Mr. al-Hariri was being put under pressure actually to present his resignation from Riyadh. This is first point. Second point, coming back to your question, well, I believe that as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia now try to take the leadership in the region, in all the region, the Arab world and Muslim world as well. And to do so, Mohammed bin Salman, the real and actual leader in Saudi Arabia or governor of Saudi Arabia, he thinks that with taking place of to interfere in some countries or to open some front, even within the GCC, like as what's happened like last June with Qatar, to create this kind of crisis. So, well, I believe that Saudi Arabia now play a very significant role in the region, and it could be very dangerous for all the region. Well, let me conclude by Saudi Arabia is not really ready to take any kind of negotiation or dialogue with Iran for the moment.
Hold that thought, but we're all agreeing that Saudi Arabia has had some role to play, but what about Iran? It has backed Hezbollah, it has backed the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. So when you talk about a proxy war or proxies being employed, Iran also is complicit in this process, isn't it?
See, let me talk in this way. We need more time to talk about this because it's a very hot issue. But in a very short, Hariri's resignation, as my colleague said, is not exactly pressure. Yeah, it is pressure from the inside of Saudi Arabia, but Hariri went back to Saudi Arabia with an empty hand after talking with Velayati, Dr. Velayati, because it happened 24 hours after he met with Dr. Velayati. So the message he sent to with his back to I mean, Saudi Arabia was not satisfied, did not satisfy the Saudis. So it is one of all the series of events as a change, starting in October from White House to Israel to Lebanon.
Just to tell our viewers where everyone stands on this, the U.S. has supported Saad Hariri's decision and backed Saudi Arabia in Lebanon. The Israelis and Channel 10 News, a credible news service in Israel, published, one of its reporters tweeted that a cable sent to Israeli diplomats asking to lobby for Saudi Hariri and against Hezbollah. Are we looking, we have been witnessing ever since the Qatar crisis, a shift in alliances and allegiances. Are we looking at a new sort of alliance emerge where Turkey, Iran could find themselves on one side as opposed to Saudi Arabia, US and Israel on the other? Jamal.
Well, you mentioned here that, and you are right, that Saudi Arabia, United States of America, as well as Israel actually, consider all these three countries, consider Iran as the main enemy and not anything else actually. So now, regarding the new order in the region, I believe since the crisis in the Gulf, since June 5th this year, a new alliance is building now actually. Yes, I totally believe with my colleague as well that the conflict is not Sunni Shi'i. It's conflict. It's not ideological conflict. It's political conflict. That's why we found that Turkey, Iran, and Qatar, as line or as axis, try to build this kind of alliances. We can mention here and notice that Turkey and Qatar are Sunni countries. Iran is present the Shia Muslim in the world. So is it true? And the second thing I would like to mention here, that Mohammed bin Salman, who is the real ruler in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has his legitimacy from two factors or two resources. The first one, interior, coming from his father, King Salman, and the second one, exterior, and coming from Donald Trump administration. But the question we have to raise here, that we know that in the United States of America, the duration of the mandate of president is 4 years. That means Mr. Trump will stay until 2020, November 2020. So Mr. Mohammed Salman would like to know all things before 2020, because no one sure that Mr. Trump will have the second mandate.
Jamal Abdullah, Mustafa Berghandan, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you've ever spent time in Istanbul, this next issue will be all too familiar. Traffic. Motorists zooming in and out of lanes, weaving their way through any open space, trying to beat the rush. Well, we sent our Adil Halim into the streets of Istanbul, literally, to find out why the city has landed on an unenviable list. It's part of a new segment we call Straight Up.
Gridlock. It's a calling card of any major metropolis. Istanbul is no different. In fact, it ranks in the top 10 in the world. That's an unenviable position, by the way. In a city with at least 15 million people, that's a lot of angry drivers. 3.75 million to be precise, and 1,000 more vehicles registered daily.
Traffic gets a little harder day by day. We'll be glad if they bring a solution for this problem.
They see it all the time, but it doesn't mean they like it.
I have been spending 3 to 3.5 hours just to get across the bridge.
And it gets worse, much worse. This city is the third worst offender when it comes to road rage, only faring better than St. Petersburg, Russia, and Bogota, Colombia. Navigation technology company TomTom says commuters in Istanbul experience the worst traffic congestion overall. The evening rush hour is no exception. The average 30-minute drive in the city will take over an hour during evening rush hour, leading to an extra 125 hours wasted stuck in traffic every year. 125 hours. Wasted, like never coming back. Insert eye roll emoji. But help could be on the way. Russian inventor Dahir Semyonov says the solution is gyro trains. Nope, not these. These, gliding over cars and people. But local solutions don't end there. Meet the Traffics trio from Ankara. These teens are trying to create an environmentally friendly solution to traffic jams. And this month they'll represent Turkey at the International Robot Olympiad in Costa Rica. Meanwhile, back on these busy Istanbul streets, any help is welcome as soon as possible. Adil Halim, Strait Talk.
And that's all for this edition of Strait Talk with me, Ali Mustafa. Next time we look at how US sanctions could be attempting to kill a $2.5 billion arms deal between Turkey and Russia. Until then, take care and goodbye.